The ballroom doors were made of glass, so I could see everything without being allowed inside. The white roses, the string quartet, my sister standing under a $40,000 floral arch like she'd always owned the world. And right there on the seating chart beside the entrance, where my name should have been, there was nothing, just a blank space like I had never existed in this family at all. And that was the moment I realized this wasn't a mistake, it was a decision, a deliberate, carefully planned decision to erase me. My name is Emily Carter, I'm 29 years old, and 2 hours ago, a security guard in a black suit stepped in front of me and said, "I'm sorry, miss, you're not on the list." Like I was some stranger trying to sneak into a private event. Not the bride's sister, not blood, not family, just a problem that had been handled, removed, and I remember standing there in heels that were already starting to hurt, holding a small velvet box in my hand, staring past him at the ceremony I wasn't allowed to attend, and for a second I thought maybe there had been a mix-up, maybe my parents forgot, maybe Olivia didn't know. But then I saw my mother inside, laughing with guests, completely relaxed, not looking for me, not wondering where I was because she already knew, she had made sure I wouldn't be there. And that's when it hit me, this wasn't new, it was just the first time they'd made it this obvious, because growing up in the Carter house, there were always two daughters, but only one that mattered. Olivia was the one with the perfect smile, the perfect grades, the kind of personality that made people lean in when she spoke, and I was the one they described as difficult, which is a polite way of saying inconvenient, too honest, too emotional, too much, and over the years that label became my identity. Every argument, every misunderstanding, every time something went wrong, is somehow traced back to me, even when it didn't, especially when it didn't. And Olivia knew exactly how to use that. She had this way of sounding soft, reasonable, like she was trying to keep the peace while quietly shifting blame in my direction. And my parents, they didn't question it, they never did, because believing her was easier than understanding me. 3 months ago, when Olivia got engaged, my mother called a family meeting in the living room, the same room where we used to open Christmas presents and pretend everything was equal, and she said, "This wedding needs to be perfect, no drama, no distractions." And then she looked directly at me, not at both of us, just me, and added, "We all need to be on our best behavior." And I remember feeling that familiar tightening in my chest, that quiet realization that I was already being positioned as the risk, the variable they needed to control. And a week later, Olivia started calling me more often, asking about my dress, my plans, telling me how much she wanted me there, how important it was that we looked like a united family. And for a moment I believed her. I thought maybe this time was different, maybe she actually wanted me beside her. But what I didn't realize then was that every conversation, every detail I shared, was being used to build a story. One where I was unstable, unpredictable, someone who might ruin her wedding day. And by the time the invitations went out, the decision had already been made. I just hadn't been informed yet. Instead, I found out standing outside a venue I wasn't allowed to enter, holding a gift they assumed was just a formality, something polite, something meaningless. But as I stood there watching the ceremony begin without me, hearing the music swell through the glass, I tightened my grip on that velvet box and realized something else. They had spent my entire life controlling the narrative, deciding who I was, what I was worth, and where I belonged, but for the first time, I had something they didn't see coming, something they didn't plan for. And as the doors closed and the officiant started speaking, I whispered to myself, almost like a promise, they thought this was the end of my role in their story. But what they didn't know was that this was exactly where mine was about to begin. I stood there for exactly 12 seconds after the doors closed, long enough for the string quartet to shift into the next piece and for two guests behind me to start whispering, trying to figure out who I was and why I had not gone inside. And I could feel their eyes on my back, the quiet judgment, the curiosity, the assumption that I must have done something to deserve being left out, because people always assume there is a reason. They do not question the system, they question the person who does not fit into it. And for a moment I almost turned around and left. I almost walked back to my car, drove the 45 minutes home, took off the dress I spent $280 on, and let this become just another story I told myself about why I was not enough. But then I looked down at the velvet box in my hand again, small, simple, nothing flashy, the kind of gift you would expect from a sister who still believed she had a place in the family. And I remembered the last conversation I had with my mother 3 days ago, her voice calm, almost rehearsed. "Emily, it might be better if you sit this one out. Not you are not invited, not you are banned," just a soft, careful suggestion that sounded reasonable until you realized it was not a suggestion at all, it was a decision already made. And when I asked why, she paused just long enough for the truth to show through. "We just cannot risk anything going wrong." And there it was again, the same pattern, the same quiet rewriting of who I was, not a daughter, not a sister, but a risk, a liability, something to be managed and minimized. And I remember gripping my phone so tightly my hand started to shake, trying to find the right words to defend myself too. Explain that I had done nothing, that I would not cause a scene, that I just wanted to be there. But the truth was, I had already said those things my entire life in different ways in different moments, and it had never changed anything because the decision was never about what I would do, it was about who they had decided I was, and once that identity was set, everything else followed, every memory filtered through it, every situation interpreted through it, and Olivia, she understood that better than anyone because 2 weeks before the wedding, she called me late at night, her voice soft, almost fragile, telling me she was overwhelmed, that she needed me, that she missed how things used to be between us. And I remember sitting on my couch, the television flickering in the background, feeling something open up inside me, something hopeful, something stupid, and I told her everything, how I was nervous about seeing everyone again, how I wanted the day to go perfectly for her, how I would do whatever she needed, and she listened, she agreed, she said all the right things, and when the call ended, I actually believed we were okay, that maybe this time finally I would not be the outsider. But the next morning my father sent a message in the family group chat, short, direct, no room for discussion. Guest list is finalized, please respect the boundaries we have set for this event. And my name was not mentioned, not included, not acknowledged, just erased, and when I tried to call him it went straight to voicemail. When I texted my mother there was no response, and when I reached out to Olivia, she said she was too busy with final preparations, that we would talk after the wedding, always after, always later, always a moment that never came. And that was when something shifted in me, something quiet but permanent, because for the first time I stopped trying to fix it, I stopped trying to prove them wrong, and instead I started paying attention, really paying attention, to the things they did not think I would notice, the inconsistencies, the small details, the timeline that did not quite add up. And what I found was not loud, not dramatic, not something you could confront in a single conversation. It was something else entirely, something that required patience, something that required planning. And that was when the idea of the gift stopped being about celebration and started becoming something else, something intentional, something precise. And as I stood outside that ballroom, hearing the officiant ask everyone to rise, I realized I was not there to beg for a seat at a table that never had a place for me. I was there to make sure the truth had won instead. But what they did not know was that the moment they thought they had removed me from the story was the exact moment they handed me control over how it would unfold next. The first time I noticed something was off was not during the argument, not during the silence that followed, but in a receipt, a simple digital confirmation that landed in my email at 2:14 in the morning 2 weeks before the wedding, because Olivia had used my old account to book something she thought I would never check. And at first I almost ignored it, I almost deleted it like spam, but there was a detail that caught my eye, the venue name, the same ballroom I was now standing outside of. And attached to that receipt was a document, a vendor agreement, one that listed final headcount, seating arrangements, and a last-minute adjustment labeled guest removal request. And under that section there was my name, Emily Carter, highlighted, approved, and signed off not just by my parents but by Olivia herself. And I remember staring at that screen for a long time, not because I was surprised, but because for the first time I had proof, something concrete, something that did not rely on interpretation or emotion, something that could not be explained away as a misunderstanding. And that was the moment everything shifted from confusion to clarity, because up until then, there was always that small voice in my head asking if maybe I was overreacting, maybe I misunderstood, maybe I had done something without realizing it. But that document, that one line, removed all of that. It showed intention, planning, agreement, and most importantly, it showed that Olivia was not caught in the middle like she always claimed. She was leading it. And once I saw that, I started looking deeper. I went back through old messages, old emails, conversations that felt harmless at the time, and I began to see a pattern, small edits to stories, slight shifts in wording, things she would say to me versus things she would say to them, and how those two versions never quite matched. And suddenly moments from years ago started making sense. Arguments where I could not figure out how things escalated so quickly, situations where I ended up apologizing for things I did not fully understand. It was all there, not loud, not obvious, but consistent, controlled, and precise. And I realized something else too, something even more important. This was not just about the wedding, it was about control, about maintaining a version of me that kept her in the center, the perfect daughter, the one who never caused problems, the one who deserved everything. And me, I was the contrast, the cautionary example, the one they could point to and say, this is what happens when things go wrong. And for years I played that role without even realizing it. But now, standing outside that ballroom, holding that velvet box, I was no longer reacting, I was executing, because that receipt was not the only thing I found, it was just the beginning. Buried in that same thread was another attachment, one Olivia must have forgotten to remove, a file labeled final arrangements. And inside it was something that changed everything, something that explained why she was so careful, so controlled, why she needed me out of the room entirely. And I remember the exact moment I opened it, sitting at my kitchen counter, the light from my laptop reflecting off the marble surface, my coffee going cold beside me, as I scrolled through pages that were not meant for me to see, and I felt that same tightness in my chest, but this time it was not pain, it was focus, because what I was looking at was not just information, it was leverage, the kind of leverage that did not require shouting or confrontation, the kind that could sit quietly in a box and wait for the exact right moment. And that was when the idea of the gift became something real, something deliberate, not a reaction to being excluded but a response to something much bigger, something they thought was completely hidden. And as I stood there now outside listening to the officiant ask if anyone objected to the union, I almost smiled because for the first time I understood the full picture, not just what they did to me, but why they needed to do it, and more importantly, why they could not afford for me to be inside that room when the truth came out. But what they did not realize was that they had already invited it in the moment they decided to leave me out. The file was not dramatic at first glance, no bold headline, no obvious scandal, just a series of contracts, payment schedules, vendor confirmations, the kind of paperwork that makes a wedding run smoothly. And that was exactly why it worked so well, because hidden inside something ordinary is where people stop looking. And as I scrolled through it that night, I started noticing the numbers, the kind of numbers you only notice when you are not supposed to see them, deposits that did not match invoices, transfers that were routed through accounts I did not recognize, and one line in particular that stood out, a payment marked as family contribution adjustment, a phrase so vague it almost meant nothing except it was tied to a separate agreement, one that was not part of the official wedding documents, one that required a different signature. And when I opened that attachment, I felt something in me go completely still, because there it was, clear, structured, undeniable, an agreement between Olivia and my parents outlining how certain funds would be allocated, how certain appearances would be maintained, and how certain information would be handled if questioned. And I remember reading it twice slowly, making sure I was not misunderstanding, because this was not just favoritism, this was coordination, this was a plan. And suddenly everything made sense, the urgency to control the guest list, the insistence that I stay away, the careful way Olivia had been managing conversations, because this wedding was not just a celebration, it was a presentation, a carefully constructed image that depended on everything looking perfect from the outside. And I was the one variable they could not control, the one person who might ask the wrong question at the wrong time, the one person who had already seen too much without realizing it. And that was when I understood why they did not just distance me, they removed me completely, because distance leaves room for doubt, but removal creates certainty, and certainty is what they needed. And I remember sitting there, the clock on my microwave reading 11:47 p.m., the room quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator, and I had a choice. I could close the file, pretend I never saw it, let the wedding happen, let the story they built continue without interruption, or I could do something else, something that did not involve yelling or confronting them in a way they could dismiss, something that did not rely on them listening to me at all. And that was when the idea shifted from possibility to decision, because I realized I did not need to be in that room to be heard, I just needed the right moment, the right method, and something that could not be ignored once it was seen. And over the next 2 weeks, I moved carefully, not emotionally, not impulsively. I gathered what I needed, verified what I could, organized everything in a way that made sense, not just to me, but to anyone who might look at it for the first time, because the truth is only powerful if it is clear, and clarity requires structure. And I knew exactly where that structure would matter most. Not in a private conversation, not in a text message that could be ignored, but in a moment where everyone was already watching, where attention was guaranteed, where interruption could not be easily brushed aside. And that moment was always going to be today, right in the middle of a ceremony designed to showcase perfection. And that is why the box in my hand was not large, not expensive, not decorated in any way that would draw attention before its time, because the point was not the box, it was what it carried. And as I stood outside watching through the glass as Olivia reached for the groom's hands, the officiant smiling, the guests leaning forward, completely absorbed in the moment they believed was unfolding exactly as planned, I felt something settle inside me, not anger, not even satisfaction, just a quiet certainty, because for the first time, I was not reacting to what they had done, I was responding to what they had hidden, and they had no idea that the one thing they worked so hard to keep out of that room was already on its way and timed, placed, and ready to appear exactly when it could no longer be ignored. The timing had to be exact, not perfect in a dramatic sense, but precise in a way that left no room for interruption or dismissal. And that was something I had learned the hard way over the years, because every time I tried to confront them directly, the conversation would shift, the focus would change, and somehow I would end up explaining myself instead of being heard, so this time I did not give them that option. I designed something that would speak for itself, something that would arrive without me needing to be there, something that would unfold in front of everyone at once, and it started with a simple step, one that almost felt too small to matter. I walked over to the event coordinator standing near the side entrance, a woman in her mid-40s with a clipboard and an earpiece, the kind of person who kept everything moving without ever being noticed, and I said, "I have a delivery for the bride, it is time sensitive." And she looked at me briefly, not recognizing me, just seeing another task to manage, and asked for the name, and when I said Olivia Carter, something shifted in her expression, not suspicion, just recognition of importance, because this was a high-profile wedding, the kind where every detail had been accounted for, every delivery scheduled, and anything unexpected had to be handled carefully. And I handed her the box, the same velvet box I had been holding all morning, and added, "It needs to be opened during the ceremony, it is part of the presentation." And that was not entirely untrue, because everything about this was a presentation, just not the one they expected, and she hesitated for a second, scanning her list, probably not finding anything that matched what I was saying, but then she glanced toward the ballroom, where the music had softened, where the officiant's voice carried through the speakers, and she made a decision, a small one, but the kind that changes everything. She nodded, took the box, and said, "I will make sure it gets to her." And just like that, it was out of my hands, literally and figuratively, and for the first time since I arrived, I felt lighter. Not relieved, not yet, but certain, because everything that needed to happen was already in motion. And as I stepped back, moving away from the entrance, blending into the edge of the venue where guests were not paying attention, I pulled out my phone, not to call anyone, not to message anyone, but to watch, because I knew exactly when it would happen. I had timed it based on the schedule, the sequence of events, the moment when attention would peak, when silence would settle just enough for anything new to be noticed. And inside, the ceremony continued, vows being exchanged, promises being made, the kind of words that sound meaningful when everything around them supports the illusion. And I could see Olivia smiling, confident, composed, exactly as she had always been when she believed she was in control, and my parents sitting in the front row, my father with his hands folded, my mother leaning slightly forward, both of them completely at ease, because from their perspective, everything was going according to plan, the problem had been removed, the risk had been managed, the story was unfolding exactly as they had written it, and for a brief moment I wondered if I should have just let it be, if I should have walked away and built a life that did not involve any of this. But then I remembered the document, the signatures, the careful way they had all agreed to erase me, and I realized this was not about the wedding anymore, it was about something much deeper, something that had been happening for years, something that would continue unless it was interrupted in a way they could not ignore. And that was when I saw it, a staff member approaching the front, moving carefully, trying not to draw attention, holding the box, my box, and for a second everything slowed down, not in reality but in my mind, because I knew that once it reached her, once it was placed in her hands, there was no going back, no way to stop what came next. And as the officiant paused, smiling, about to transition to the next part of the ceremony, Olivia turned slightly, noticing the movement, her expression shifting just enough to show curiosity, and she reached out to take the box, still unaware, still confident, still believing this was just another controlled moment in a perfectly planned day. But what she did not know was that the one thing she had worked so hard to keep hidden was now sitting in her hands, waiting to be opened in front of everyone. Olivia did not open it right away, and that was the first sign that something was not going according to her plan, because she hesitated, just for a second, her fingers resting on the edge of the velvet box while the entire room waited, and you could see it in the way her smile tightened slightly, the way her eyes flicked toward my parents in the front row, like she was silently asking if this was expected, if this was safe, and my mother leaned forward just a little, her expression shifting from calm to alert, not alarmed yet, but aware, because something unplanned had entered the sequence. And in a setting like this, even the smallest deviation stands out, and the officiant, still holding his place, smiled politely and said, "It looks like we have something special here," trying to keep the tone light, to maintain the flow, because no one in that room wanted to believe anything was wrong. They wanted this to be a charming interruption, a sentimental gesture, a moment that added to the story instead of disrupting it. And Olivia, still composed, nodded slightly, playing along, because that is what she always did. She adapted, she controlled the narrative in real time, and she said, "It is probably just a gift," her voice steady, almost amused, and that was when she opened it, slowly, carefully, as if the pace itself could control what came next. and from where I stood outside, I could not hear the exact sound of the clasp, but I could see the moment it released, the subtle shift in her posture, the way her shoulders straightened as she lifted the lid. And at first, nothing happened, no immediate reaction, no dramatic gasp, just a pause, a stillness that lasted maybe 2 seconds but felt much longer, because in those 2 seconds she was processing, reading, understanding, and then her expression changed, not dramatically, not in a way that would draw instant attention, but enough that someone who knew her would notice, the confidence slipping just slightly, the control adjusting, and she lowered her gaze back into the box, as if hoping that what she saw would change if she looked at it again. But it did not, because inside that box was not just one item, it was a set of documents printed, organized, structured in a way that made them impossible to misinterpret, and on top of everything placed deliberately was a single page, the agreement, the one with her signature, my parents' signatures, the one that outlined everything they had tried to keep quiet, and she knew exactly what it was the moment she saw it, because you do not forget signing something like that, especially not when it was never meant to be seen by anyone else. And I could see her breathing change just slightly, her chest rising a bit faster, her fingers tightening around the edge of the paper, and the groom standing across from her, leaned in a little confused, asking something I could not hear, and she did not answer right away because she was calculating, deciding, figuring out how to respond, how to contain it, how to keep the moment from slipping away from her control. And that was when my father stood up, not abruptly, not in a way that would cause a scene, but deliberately, stepping forward just enough to close the distance, his expression calm but focused, the same look he used in business meetings when something unexpected came up, and he said something to her, low, controlled, likely telling her to set it aside, to continue to deal with it later, because that is how they handled everything, delay, redirect, deny. But this time it did not work, because Olivia did not move to close the box, she did not hand it off, she did not pretend it was nothing. Instead she looked up, not at my father, not at the officiant, but out at the room, at the guests, at the people who had come to witness something perfect, and for the first time since the ceremony began. There was a crack, small but undeniable, and the silence that followed was not part of the script. It was not planned, it was not controlled, it was real, and in that silence everything shifted, because the moment she hesitated, the moment she did not immediately contain it, the entire room became aware that something was wrong, and what they did not know yet, what no one in that room knew yet, was that the truth sitting in her hands was only the beginning of what was about to unfold. No one spoke for almost 5 seconds, and in a room filled with over 100 people, that kind of silence does not happen unless something has broken. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that everyone can feel even if they do not yet understand it. And Olivia was still standing there, the document in her hands, her eyes scanning the page again like she was trying to find a version of it that did not exist. And the groom shifted his weight slightly, glancing between her and the officiant, unsure whether to step in or stay still, because the moment no longer belonged to the ceremony, it belonged to whatever was inside that box. And my father took another step forward, his voice low but firm, the kind of tone that was meant to close things down without creating a scene. Olivia, we can look at that later. And for a second it almost worked, because she blinked like she was coming back to herself, like she might follow the script they had always followed, defer, redirect, continue, but then she looked back at the page, at the signatures, at the details that could not be softened or explained away in a single sentence, and something in her expression shifted again, not panic, not yet, but recognition, the kind that settles in when you realize a situation is no longer contained. And she said quietly at first, "This is not right." And that was the worst possible thing she could have said, because now it was no longer invisible, now it had a voice, and once something is spoken in a room like that, it cannot be pulled back, it spreads, it grows, it invites attention. And the guests, who had been politely still, began to lean forward, whispers starting at the edges of the room, small at first, then building, because people are drawn to disruption, especially when it appears in a place that was supposed to be flawless. And the officiant cleared his throat gently, trying to guide things back. "Perhaps we can continue." But Olivia did not move, she did not hand the box away, she did not close it. Instead, she pulled out the top page fully, holding it in a way that made it visible, not to everyone yet, but enough that those closest could see that this was not a card, not a note, not anything that belonged in a wedding ceremony. And my mother stood up now, slower than my father had, but with more tension in her posture, her eyes fixed on the paper. And I could see the moment she recognized it, the way her shoulders stiffened, the way her lips pressed together, because she knew exactly what Olivia was holding. And that was when the room changed, not just in sound but in energy, because now there were two people reacting, not just one. And When two people react the same way to something unexpected, everyone else starts to pay attention differently, not as observers but as witnesses, and the groom finally spoke, his voice uncertain. "Olivia, what is it?" And she did not answer him directly. Instead she looked at my parents, then back at the page and said louder this time, "Why is this here?" And there was no accusation in her tone yet, just confusion, but it was enough because now the question was in the air, and questions demand answers, especially in front of an audience, and my father stepped closer, reaching out slightly, not grabbing, not forcing, just enough to signal that he wanted to take control of the situation. "Give it to me," he said, still controlled, still measured, but there was something underneath it now, something sharper, because control was slipping and Olivia hesitated, and that hesitation was everything because for the first time she was not immediately aligning with them, not immediately following their lead. She was processing independently, and that broke the pattern they had relied on for years. And in that moment, I realized something I had not fully expected. This was not just exposing them, it was forcing her to see it too, to confront it in a way she never had to before. And as she slowly lowered the page, still not handing it over, still holding onto it like she needed to understand it before letting anyone else take it away, the room fell into another kind of silence, not confusion this time but anticipation, because everyone could feel it now. Something had shifted, something real, something that did not belong in a scripted ceremony. And what they did not know, what none of them realized yet, was that this was only the first layer of what was about to be revealed. The shift did not happen all at once, it moved through the room in layers, starting with the people closest to the aisle, then spreading outward like a ripple, because now more guests could see the page in Olivia's hands, could see that it was not decorative, not sentimental, not something that belonged in a ceremony, and whispers turned into quiet conversations, heads leaned closer together, phones lowered slightly as attention shifted from capturing the moment to understanding it. And Olivia, still holding the paper, looked at my father again, but this time her expression was different, less controlled, less certain, because she was no longer just managing a situation, she was inside it, and she said louder now, "This has your signature on it." And that was the second break, because now it was specific, now it pointed somewhere, and my father's jaw tightened just slightly, the kind of reaction most people would miss, but not me, not after years of watching him navigate uncomfortable moments. And he responded quickly, "It is not what you think," a phrase that sounds reassuring but never actually explains anything, and Olivia shook her head once, a small movement but firm, then "Explain it." And there it was, the moment no one in that room had expected, not the interruption, not the confusion, but the shift in alignment, because she was no longer standing with them, she was asking them, and that changed everything. And my mother stepped forward now, her voice softer, trying a different approach. "Olivia, this is not the time." But Olivia did not look at her, she kept her eyes on the page, scanning down, turning it slightly, and that was when she saw the second section, the one that detailed the adjustments, the agreements, the part that connected everything together in a way that could not be dismissed as a misunderstanding. And her grip tightened again, and this time the reaction was visible, her shoulders pulling in just slightly, her posture shifting from presentation to defense, and the groom, now clearly unsettled, reached out gently, touching her arm. "What is going on?" And she finally turned to him, holding the page just enough for him to see, not the entire document, but enough for his expression to change to confusion first, then something sharper, something more focused, because he was reading real information, not emotion, not interpretation, but structure, numbers, agreements. And he looked up at my father, then back at Olivia, and the officiant, realizing that control had fully slipped, stepped back slightly, no longer trying to guide the ceremony, because it was no longer a ceremony, it was something else entirely. And I could see guests shifting in their seats now, some leaning into the aisle, others whispering more openly, because the uncertainty had turned into curiosity. And curiosity in a room like that does not stay quiet for long. And Olivia, still holding the page, said something I could not hear clearly, but I could see the shape of the words. "Why would you do this?" And my father's response came immediately, faster this time, less measured. "Lower your voice," which only made it louder, because now people knew there was something to hear, something being contained. And Olivia did the opposite, not shouting, not causing a scene, but refusing to shrink the moment. "You signed this," she said again. And now there was no softness left in her tone, no attempt to smooth it over, just a direct statement that could not be redirected. And my mother reached for her arm gently, trying to guide her back, trying to physically move the moment forward. But Olivia did not move. She stayed exactly where she was, in the center, in front of everyone, holding the truth they had tried to keep behind closed doors. And that was when the third shift happened, the one that changed the room completely, because now it was no longer about what the document said, it was about why it existed, and why it had been hidden, and why I had been removed from the room in the first place. And as Olivia slowly lifted the rest of the contents from the box, revealing that there was more, not just one page, not just one agreement, but a sequence, a structure, something that built on itself, the murmurs grew louder, more focused, more directed, because people were starting to understand that this was not an accident, not a misunderstanding, but something intentional, something planned, and what they still did not know, what no one in that room realized yet, was that the final piece had not even been seen. Olivia did not stop at the first page, and that was the moment everything crossed a line that could not be undone, because instead of folding it back into the box, instead of handing it to my father or setting it aside like he wanted, she pulled out the next document, and then another, each one sliding into view in a sequence that made it clear this was not a single mistake, not an isolated agreement, but a structure, something built piece by piece, and the groom leaned closer now, no longer asking questions, just reading, his expression tightening with each page, and my father's voice came again, sharper this time. "That is enough." But Olivia did not stop, she kept going, because now it was not about controlling the moment, it was about understanding it, and understanding requires seeing everything, not just the part you are told to accept. And one of the guests near the front shifted in their seat, turning slightly to get a better view, and that small movement spread because people follow attention, and attention was now fully on Olivia, on what she was holding, on what she was revealing without even intending to. And my mother's voice came next, quieter but urgent, "Olivia, please." And that word "please" landed differently, because it was not about guiding her anymore, it was about stopping her, and Olivia froze for a second, not because she was obeying, but because she had reached the final page, the one placed at the bottom of the stack, the one I had positioned deliberately so it would not be seen until everything else had already been understood, and she stared at it longer than the others, her eyes moving slowly across the lines, and then she looked up, not at my parents this time, but at the groom, and there was something new in her expression, not confusion, not even shock, but realization, the kind that changes how you see everything that came before it. And she said quietly but clearly, "You knew about this." And the groom's response was immediate, "No." But it came too fast, too instinctive, the kind of answer people give before they fully process what they are being asked. And that hesitation, that slight mismatch between the question and the answer was enough, because now the focus shifted again, not just to my parents, but to him, and Olivia held the page up slightly, not high enough for the entire room to see, but enough for him to read it clearly, and whatever was written there, whatever detail connected the last piece of the structure, it changed the balance completely, because his posture shifted, his shoulders pulling back slightly, his expression tightening in a way that was no longer just confusion, and he said more carefully this time, "I did not know it was structured like this." And that sentence, that one sentence, did more than any accusation could have, because it confirmed that something existed to be structured, something that had layers, something that had been presented differently depending on who was looking at it. And the room reacted to that, not loudly, not all at once, but in a collective shift, a quiet understanding that whatever was happening here was bigger than a misunderstanding, bigger than a family disagreement. It was something organized, something intentional, and Olivia lowered the page slightly, her grip loosening just enough to show that the weight of it had settled in, and she looked back at my parents, not with anger, not yet, but with a clarity that had not been there before. "You removed her for this," she said, and even though she did not say my name, everyone knew exactly who she meant, and my father did not answer immediately, which was unusual because he always had an answer, always had a way to redirect, to reframe, to regain control, but this time the silence stretched, and in that silence the truth filled the space, not spoken, not explained, but present, undeniable. And as Olivia stood there, holding the full picture in her hands, the ceremony that was supposed to unite two people had become something else entirely, something that exposed what had been carefully hidden. And what they still did not realize, what none of them understood yet, was that the most important part was not what was written on those pages, but the fact that everyone in that room had now seen enough to start asking their own questions. The silence after Olivia spoke my absence out loud felt heavier than anything that had come before, because now it had a shape, now it had a target, and even though I was not in that room, I was suddenly at the center of it, not as a problem to be removed, but as a question that could not be ignored. And the groom looked between Olivia and my parents again, slower this time, more deliberate, as if recalibrating everything he thought he understood about the people standing in front of him. "And," he said carefully, "who is she talking about?" And that question, simple as it was, carried across the room in a way nothing else had, because it invited clarity, it demanded a name, and for a brief second no one answered, not my father, not my mother, not even Olivia, because saying it would mean acknowledging it fully, and my father finally stepped forward, placing himself slightly between Olivia and the guests, not aggressively, but strategically, positioning himself as the one who would define what this moment meant, and he said, "This is a private family matter," the same phrase he had used countless times to shut things down, to move conversations out of sight, out of hearing, out of reach, but this time it did not land the same way because nothing about this was private anymore. Not with over 100 people watching, not with documents in plain view, not with questions already forming in the room, and Olivia shook her head once firm. "You made it public," she said, and there was no hesitation in her voice now, no attempt to soften the edges, because the line had already been crossed, and my mother stepped closer, her tone shifting to something more emotional, more personal. "Olivia, please, this is your day." But that only made it clearer, because if this was truly nothing, if this was truly harmless, there would be no need to redirect, no need to protect the moment, and Olivia turned slightly toward the guests now, not addressing them directly, but no longer hiding from them either, and she said, "They removed my sister from the wedding, and this time she did say it fully, clearly, and the reaction was immediate, not loud but sharp, a collective intake of breath, a shift in posture, because now the story had a person, a role, a missing piece that everyone could understand, and the groom's expression changed again, something settling in behind his eyes as he looked back at my parents. "Why?" he asked, and that question, simple as it was, cut through everything else, because it was not about the documents anymore, not about the structure, not about the agreements, it was about intent, and intent is harder to explain, harder to justify, and my father opened his mouth to respond, but Olivia spoke first, holding up the page again. "Because of this," she said, and even though the guests could not read it clearly, they did not need to, because the connection had already been made, the cause and effect laid out in front of them, and my father's response came slower now, more measured. "You do not understand the full context." Which was true in a way, because context is always the last place people hide, but Olivia did not back down. "Then explain it," she said again, and this time there was no room left to redirect, no space to delay, because the room had shifted from passive observation to active expectation. People were not just watching anymore, they were waiting, and my mother's hand moved slightly, reaching for Olivia again but stopping short, as if even she understood that physical gestures would not solve this. Not now, not here, and the officiant, who had been silent for several minutes, stepped back even further, completely removed from the center, because whatever this was, it had replaced the ceremony entirely, and I could see it from where I stood, through the glass, through the distance, the exact moment when control left my parents completely, not because they had lost authority, but because the room no longer recognized it. And as Olivia lowered the page just slightly, her eyes still fixed on them, waiting not for comfort, not for reassurance, but for truth, I realized something I had not fully expected. This was no longer about exposing them, it was about forcing them to speak in a space where silence was no longer an option. But what they still did not realize was that even if they chose their words carefully, even if they tried to reshape the narrative one more time, it was already too late to control how it would be heard. My father did answer, but not in the way anyone expected, not with a clear explanation, not with the kind of honesty that might have softened what was already unfolding. Instead, he adjusted his posture slightly, straightened his jacket, and spoke in that same controlled tone he had used for years, the one that made everything sound reasonable even when it was not. "Your sister has always struggled with boundaries," he said, and for a second it almost worked, because the phrasing was familiar. The kind of statement that shifts focus without directly denying anything, but the room had already changed and people were no longer listening the same way. They were comparing what he said to what they had just seen, and those two things did not align, and Olivia's reaction was immediate, not loud, not explosive, but precise. "That is not what this says," she replied, lifting the page again slightly, and that was the difference, because he was speaking in generalities and she was holding specifics, and specifics are harder to override. And my mother stepped in next, her voice softer, more emotional, trying to pull the moment back into something manageable. "Emily has had a difficult time. For years," she said, and there it was, my name finally spoken by them, but not as truth, as framing, as context designed to justify what they had done. And I could see some of the guests nod slightly, not in agreement but in recognition, because everyone has heard that kind of explanation before, the one that sounds compassionate on the surface but quietly assigns blame underneath. And Olivia did not argue with it directly. She did something else instead. She turned the page, revealing Another section, another line, another detail that did not match the story being told, and she said, "Then why did you sign this?" And she pointed to a specific part, one that clearly outlined the decision, the removal, the coordination, and my father's expression shifted again, just slightly, the kind of shift that only happens when there is no easy way out, and he said, "It was necessary." And that word necessary landed harder than anything else because it did not deny the action, it justified it, and the room reacted to that, not loudly but in a collective stillness, because now the intention was clear, and Olivia took a small step back, not away from them, but away from the structure they had built, creating space between herself and the narrative she had always been part of. And she looked at the groom again, then back at my parents, and said, "You removed her to protect this." And she gestured slightly to the documents, to the arrangement, to everything that had been hidden beneath the surface of what was supposed to be a celebration. And my mother tried again. "We did what we thought was best." But that sentence no longer carried weight, not in a room where evidence had already replaced assumption, and the groom's voice came next, steadier now, more grounded. "Best for who?" And that question did not just sit between them, it spread, because everyone in that room was now asking it in their own way, and my father did not answer immediately. And that pause, that hesitation, was louder than anything he could have said, because it showed the gap, the space where the truth should have been, and Olivia lowered the page slowly, her grip loosening just enough to show that something inside her had shifted, not breaking but recalibrating, because for the first time she was not standing inside their version of the story, she was looking at it from the outside, and that changes everything. And as the silence stretched again, longer this time, heavier, more defined, I realized that this was the moment I had been building toward, not the reveal itself, not the documents, not even the interruption of the ceremony, but this, the point where their words no longer controlled the narrative, where every explanation they offered had to stand next to visible proof, and where the people around them were no longer passive listeners but active witnesses. And what they still did not understand, what they could not see yet, was that even if they managed to speak their way through this moment, even if they found a way to contain it temporarily, the shift that had just happened in that room was permanent, because once people see the difference between what is said and what is shown, they do not forget it. The room did not return to normal, not even slightly, because once the question had been asked and left unanswered, everything that followed existed inside that silence, and Olivia stood there, no longer adjusting her posture, no longer trying to maintain the image that had been built around her, just holding the pages at her side now, as if the weight of them had already done what they needed to do. And my father finally spoke again, but this time there was a difference, not in volume, not in control, but in direction, because instead of addressing Olivia, he turned slightly toward the guests, toward the audience that had become impossible to ignore, and said, "There has been a misunderstanding." But even as the words left his mouth, they felt smaller than they had before, less effective, because misunderstandings do not come with signatures, they do not come with structured agreements, they do not require someone to be removed entirely from an event to keep them from being seen. And Olivia shook her head slowly, not in anger but in certainty. "No," she said, "this was planned." And that word, planned, settled into the room differently than anything else, because it removed the possibility of accident, it removed the comfort of confusion, it replaced it with intention, and the groom took a step back now, just enough to create space between himself and the center of the situation, not leaving, not walking away, but repositioning as if he needed distance to understand what he was looking at, and he said, "I need to understand what I am standing in." And that sentence changed the focus again, because now it was not just about what had happened, it was about what it meant for the moment everyone thought they were part of. And my mother reached out again, but this time not toward Olivia, toward him, her voice softer, more urgent. "This does not change anything." And for a brief second that sentence hung in the air, fragile, almost hopeful, because it was the last attempt to preserve the structure they had built, the idea that the ceremony could continue, that the day could be saved, that what had been revealed could somehow be contained within the edges of this moment. But the groom did not respond immediately. He looked at Olivia, then at the pages in her hand, then back at my parents, and said, "It changes everything if it is true." And there it was, the final shift, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute, because now the outcome was no longer being decided by them, it was being weighed by someone outside their control, someone who had not been part of the structure, someone who could see it without the layers of justification that had been built over time. And Olivia lowered the pages completely now, letting them rest against her side, and for the first time since the box was opened, she was not reacting to what she was seeing, she was deciding what to do with it, and she looked at my parents again, but not with confusion anymore, not even with accusation, just with clarity. "You should have told me," she said, and my father's response came quickly, almost reflexively. "We were protecting you." And that was the final piece, because that word protecting was the same word they had used for years, the same word that justified every decision, every exclusion, every quiet shift of control, but now it sat next to everything else that had been revealed, and it did not hold the same weight, it did not close the gap, it did not resolve the tension, it exposed it, and the room felt it, not as noise, not as chaos, but as a collective understanding that something fundamental had just been uncovered. Something that could not be unseen, and as Olivia stood there, the ceremony paused indefinitely, the guests watching, the officiant silent, the structure of the day suspended in a moment that no one had planned for, I realized that this was the point where everything they had built stopped holding together, not because it collapsed loudly, but because the connections that kept it in place had been seen, questioned, and separated, and what they still did not fully grasp, what they could not yet accept, was that even if they managed to move forward from this moment, even if the ceremony continued in some form, the version of the story they had relied on was already gone. Olivia did not say anything for a long time after that, and neither did anyone else, because there was nothing left to guide the moment forward, no music, no script, no expectation to fall back on, just a room full of people watching something real unfold in a place that had been designed for something perfect. And then she took a slow breath, steadying herself in a way that felt deliberate, not emotional, not reactive, but clear, and she turned to the groom fully now, facing him instead of the audience, instead of my parents, and said, "I need a minute." And he nodded immediately, no hesitation this time, no confusion, just agreement, because whatever this was, it mattered more than the timeline they had planned, and Olivia stepped back from the center, not running, not leaving, just creating space, and for the first time since the ceremony began, she was no longer performing, she was deciding, and my father tried once more, his voice quieter now, less controlled than before. "Olivia, we can talk about this after." But she did not respond, she did not even look at him, and that absence of acknowledgement was louder than anything she could have said, because it showed that the authority he had relied on no longer held the same weight, and my mother stood still beside him, her hands clasped tightly, her expression fixed in a way that suggested she was trying to hold on to something that was already slipping, and the guests, who had been watching in silence, began to shift again. But this time not out of curiosity but out of understanding, because the story had changed, the roles had shifted, and everyone could feel it, and I stood outside, still separated by glass and distance, but no longer invisible, because even without being in the room, I was part of every decision now, every question, every realization, and I watched as Olivia walked a few steps away from the altar, still holding the pages, still processing what they meant, and then she stopped, turned back slightly, and said something that carried clearly enough for me to see it in her expression even if I could not hear every word. "If this is how it started, I need to know what else is not real." And that was it, the final break, not between people but between versions of the truth, because once that question is asked, it does not stay contained, it expands, it reaches backward into everything that came before, and forward into everything that might come next, and the groom did not argue, he did not try to pull her back into the ceremony. He simply stood where he was, giving her the space she asked for, and that, more than anything else, showed that the foundation of the moment had shifted completely, and my father said nothing this time, not because he had nothing to say, but because there was nothing left that would restore what had already been seen, and my mother's gaze dropped slightly, just for a second, before she looked back up, but the composure she had held all morning was no longer intact, and the officiant remained silent, hands folded, waiting, because even he understood that this was no longer his moment to guide, and as the room settled into this new stillness, not tense, not chaotic, but changed, I realized that this was never about stopping the ceremony in a dramatic way. It was about stopping the version of the story they had controlled for years, and replacing it with something that could no longer be managed or rewritten, and for the first time in my life I was not standing outside of it, trying to be let in. I was the reason it had been interrupted in the first place. And as Olivia stood there, holding the truth they had hidden, deciding what to do with it next, I understood something I had not fully allowed myself to believe before. I had never been the problem they needed to remove, I had been the part they needed to hide, and now that I was no longer hidden, neither was anything else.